I know you may not have the data and signals like encrypted and everything, but if you could guess how many world leaders and CEOs are texting each other on Signal right now?
My guess, because again, our whole deal is not knowing, is most of them. Why wouldn't you, given the stakes, given who you're accountable to and what you're accountable to do, why would you trust that with a breach? Why would you trust that with a company that could be breached? So I think most people with high stakes job understand that communication privacy is essential to getting business done.
All right, now I know we're here to talk about AI, but I have to start with Signalgate, which sort of felt like it burst Signal out of, whatever niche it's been in, if it's been in a niche, into, the mainstream, the front pages, the evening news. I've read your initial reaction was when this happened. Expand.
I read the Atlantic story at my kitchen table. I got up a glass of water, I sat back down and I read it again because WTF was in fact my reaction. And then I didn't expect we would become the main character because it seemed a pretty, it was an outrageous, operatic, kind of dramatic story, but it was ultimately a story about, a guy making a mistake with his thumbs and using Signal for, in place of a skiff. But we did become the main character. There was like one day where there was like 3 stories above the fold in the New York Times. All of them had the word Signal in it. And I was like, well, my comms person is happy. But we ended up spending a huge amount of time effectively explaining the basics of end-to-end encryption, the differences, of Signal versus other platforms, how these technologies worked at the most basic levels, because everyone was covering it. It wasn't just tech journalists. It was, the culture journalists, the finance journalists. Everyone was covering it. Everyone wanted to take. And the real danger there was that some sort of misunderstanding of how the technology worked would sort of, lead to a story around Signal being flawed that we know has real consequences, because we face disinformation campaigns constantly, pretty obviously meant to steer people away from Signal, which is secure, toward less secure platforms that would then intercept, would allow surveillance. And so we take that very seriously. So there was a number of days where I was awake about 20 hours just repeating sort of, like asking my comms guy, do you have like a metaphor for encryption that might work with this person? How do we do this? Ultimately, it turned out well for us, but it was a bit stressful, let's say.
Did you correspond at all with the Trump administration around it?
We had people we were talking to, cutouts of people who knew them. We were, again, we're not like the car used for an event drove on the road. It's not really a story about the road, right? But what we wanted to make sure is that sort of the integrity of Signal was clear, that if there were questions about Signal, we were there to answer them, and they weren't answered, in strange or inaccurate ways. And that we were very clear that if Signal goes away, you can't replace it. It has over a decade of legacy. It is open source. Our cryptographic protocol has been reviewed by every significant cryptographer, security engineer. If you found a bug in our cryptography, you would get hired anywhere. So there is an ecosystem of people who've been examining Signal. And don't forget, Signal came out in the late 2000s. So this is just around the time of the iPhone. This is before WhatsApp. This was not a saturated market, and network effects control markets for communication technologies. So if you got rid of Signal, you can't just snap your fingers, however technologically virtuosic you are, and create an alternative, because if your friends don't use Signal, if your counterparts don't use Signal, you can't use Signal. So we recognize how precious this infrastructure is. It is the core communication infrastructure for militaries, governments, intelligence agencies, your boardrooms, I assume, and if not, good time to start. And that's because almost everything else we use collects data, creates data that then can be used to compromise us. And throughout human history, the norm has been private communication. That has been eroded quickly, then, even more quickly over the past 30 years via a business model that ultimately relies on monetizing data collected from our interactions, our communications, our social networks, et cetera. And so, here I am sitting here discussing that.
So along with world leaders, journalists, we use it all the time, maybe sometimes national security advisors, how do you think about the risk of bad actors using Signal, and how do you characterize and quantify that risk?
I'm going to, look, we're a nonprofit. I don't have a board pushing me, so I have the extraordinary luxury of being just really honest. Very relaxing life to lead. And
go for it. That's what we want.
First answer here is that what we are talking about is math. End-to-end encryption is a mathematical protocol, and either it works for everyone, the person you hate the most in the world, or it doesn't work for anyone. That includes the people you love the most, the human rights workers, the dissidents, the politicians who are trying to do their job in a tricky situation, whatever it is, right? You cannot undermine encryption just so the good guys can get in. Any backdoor, any vulnerability will be exploited by bad actors, hostile nation states, hackers, you name it. That is the long-standing and clearly established technical consensus. And it doesn't matter if you have an AI wand, a magic wand, you burn some sage to the gods of math. It is not changing. Those are the stakes. Now, I also want to say we are in a golden age of surveillance of data. Law enforcement and others have never had access to more data than exists right now. And the issue really is, how do you make use of that, right? Are you hiring more personnel? Are you, spinning up an AI model to summarize it? But when you actually talk to the practitioners in the field in law enforcement, oftentimes their issue is like, yeah, we have so much signal, but we can't figure out or we have so much data, we have so much noise, we can't figure out where the signal in the noise is because it's coming at us so fast. We have data brokers, we have pipelines to different sort of infrastructures, we're sucking up all the SMS data. Like, they have never had it so good there. Then how do you actually find the signal that a bad actor is going to act, or who a bad actor is, given that there is so much data? So you, before going to Signal, had a decade-long career at Google. You were a researcher. You really dug into policy and ethics, especially around AI. You've talked about how AI agents are a privacy nightmare. Why? Well, okay, let's I've done a lot of AI research. I had the privilege of, I started at Google in 2006. So back when the dinosaurs roamed, we had desktops. They were chained to our desk. There was no iPhone. I had a BlackBerry issued to me with you remember the keyboard? I wish it would come back. So a completely different world. And so I had this inside view from back in the day where machine learning was one of a grab bag of techniques that the researchers working on ad optimization would sometimes use, but it was not that fancy, to now when AI is kind of a new godhead and we're all just sort of invoking it, right? And what I saw then was the sort of development of a set of technologies that came into being in relationship to the fact that these companies had developed business models that had huge amounts of data and infrastructure to process and use that data, right? Because they were indexing search, they were, indexing ads, they were supporting large platforms with a lot of content on it. And there was a recognition around the early 2010s throughout industry that, oh my God, deep learning-based approaches that actually date from the late 1980s, early 1990s can do new and really cool things, not because they are new, but because we now newly have access to huge amounts of data and compute, and then we can parallelize that using gaming and all of this. And when we do that, we can do really cool things like optimize our engagement-driven social media algorithm much better because we're able to process all of that data. So there was a new utility for old techniques discovered then, and we are still in that paradigm. We are still in the paradigm of large-scale, deep learning-based AI. There are many, many other approaches that could be used. And you saw Dario up here, and he's a very good actor in this space in terms of being willing to call out these harms. But his and Anthropic's focus, and many of these companies, is on building models that increase the sort of efficacy of that paradigm. Larger, more data, sort of more comprehensive. And then we see these models implemented as part of so-called agents. Agents are sort of a broad term, but it basically means it has access to data and can act independently based on that data. The issue that we have at Signal is the implementations of these agents we are seeing, particularly in the operating system, which is the water that any application swims in, are pretty perilous for our future. because they need access to data. They are acting independently based on this access. And so you have this sort of the marketing pitch for agents. It's going to plan your birthday party for you, and it's going to tell your friends what time your birthday is. Coordinate with your friends for your birthday party. Great. You have a magic genie. It's going to live your life, and you can go out and sort of walk the promenade in peace. Of course, in order to do that, it needs access to your calendar. It needs access to your credit card to book a restaurant. It needs to be able to simulate mouse clicks, access your browser, search history, et cetera. And in this scenario, it would need access to your signal in order to contact your friends, message them, coordinate a time, bringing that all back into a shared context window where you have kind of a data slurry created on your desktop that it's acting on so autonomously. And that is what we've called breaking the blood-brain barrier between the application and the operating system, because our encryption no longer matters if all you have to do is sort of, hijack this context window, that has effectively root permissions running in your operating system to access things like your signal data. So, we have seen, these systems aren't magic, right? These systems are hardware and software with all the limitations there. And we know that these things are extraordinarily vulnerable. And we know that, if you give a system like that sort of root access permissions, it can be, it can be hijacked, it can be undermined. And so I think this is, it's incumbent on the companies that are deploying these, that are wrapping the models in hardware and software, to really recognize how reckless it would be to sort of deploy these things in ways that undermine privacy and security of things like Signal. And so this is why we're talking about it. There are ways to do it better. I think Anthropic is, again, a very good actor here. But the stakes, when you're talking about the operating system, couldn't be higher, because this is,
And even before we get to agents, you've got, so many of us are dumping our deepest and darkest secrets into ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, and then we're becoming increasingly comfortable doing so. I'm curious, what are your AI habits? Like, what do you use? What do you avoid?
Occasionally I'll use ChatGPT or Perplexity for research, but I always check my sources, right? Like, these are not inherently accurate. I don't write with AI. Like, writing is a process of real, intellectual interrogation for me if it's serious. I do scholarship, I do academic work, so I like to sit there with that sort of, Nietzschean discomfort with ideas until I understand something, and then, I really understand it. Mm-hmm. You can, pull a string, and I will know what I think, because I've had to struggle with it. And I think that's actually, when I think about AI in education, when I think about what education is in terms of training the human to engage with complex realities and actually synthesize that and come up with conclusions that are responsible and clear and intellectually stimulating, we cannot lose that capacity. I think, I use it, we have coding agents that people use, but they are responsible for their commit. If that commit is insecure, if that code doesn't work, they're responsible for it. It's their fault. I don't really care what they used. And they had better be able to maintain that code base. And this is an issue we don't always talk about, right? If you're spitting out a bunch of code, but you don't understand it, it's going into your repo, you're pushing that to production. 2 years later, there's a vulnerability, there's something, and you don't understand that. That's a huge issue, because software is living, right? It's in relationship to a complex set of dependencies, to the platforms it runs on, to the tooling it uses, all of which are changing constantly, which means that even software that has integrity one time may actually grow out of integrity, because in relationship to another part of the system, it no longer works. And so, this is why you can't just sort of ship something and have it work forever. We have to pay teams of engineers to attend to this constantly, like a living creature. And so I think there's these sort of things that are just the reality if you work in tech, that get abstracted away in the promise of sort of, seamless ease and autonomy that is often part of the marketing hype around AI.
You left Google in 2019 after leading protests around AI, around military contracts. What do you think of the tech industry's pendulum swing under the Trump administration?
I want to characterize that a bit more specifically. I think, ultimately, I'm a student of history. And centralized surveillance power, centralized control is never that healthy. And my concern was that you had companies that had so much incredibly intimate information about global populations that were also going to be aligned with one or another nation state's military. And it was me and thousands of people, right? Because structurally, that is something that is not healthy. And I'll just put that out there. Again, I get to be honest, I know, talking. But we can look back through history. This is what is unprecedented now here is the amount of information, the seamlessness of that information, and the ability to sort of mine and use that information. And we know that state control or centralized control, authoritarian control is largely constituted via information asymmetries like that. The ability to repress and fracture social and economic bonds by weaponizing your most intimate information. What would you not do in order to prevent every single text message you've ever written to everyone being put in a database and sent to everyone you know, your in-laws, your church, everyone, right? Everyone's like, oh my God, I would do a lot to prevent that. Me too, right? By the way, because I'm a human being. So that's, that was the issue that myself and thousands of other people who understood the inside of that business were raising there. So it's not, it's not just like, it's not an anti-military or anti-tech. Mm-hmm. It's like structurally this configuration is something we should be concerned about. And if we want to acquit ourselves honorably in this one wild life, we should do something about it.
So tech's kissing of the ring. What do you make of that?
I am a technologist. I'm not a politician. But what I will say is what was I Googled 2006 to 2019, right? It's not like I saw the Obama election. I saw the Biden election. Every presidential election, you have your policy shop gets cleared, and you hire the people as close as possible, like sleeping with the chief of staff of the new president, because you want people who understand what's happening. You want that influence. You shift your policies. You shift who you're hiring on K Street, all of it, and that's pretty standard. Not because these are sort of evil corporations, but because structurally they need to sort of maximize shareholder value. They need to serve their board. They need to be in the position to talk to the people who now have the levers that they want to influence in service of their business model. Mm-hmm. So again, when I look at this, I'm a structural analyst here. Like structurally, that's just what happened. Now there may be people very unhappy with this administration, but what is happening is not outside of the norm of what I saw over 20 years.
Of the leading frontier models, it sounds like you like Anthropic. Which do you think will end up, quote unquote, succeeding or dominating, and why?
I don't,
How does this play out?
We are in a monoculture in AI, again, sort of talking about this deep learning based approach that requires huge amounts of data, huge amounts of compute, and that I think Dario was really astute to mention these benchmarks, right? How we measure matters. How we determine who is winning matters. And if our benchmarks are off, then we're going to be picking winners that might not actually serve us. I think there is a lot of room, a huge amount of room to invest in AI techniques that aren't cataloged under the umbrella of deep learning, this one approach, but are actually much more sensitive to different domains, use cases, and needs. Talking about finance. What does finance need? Is it actually meeting your productivity and customer requirements when it is deployed on your infrastructure, with your legacy data, with your legacy systems, with your labor processes? How do we begin measuring that? And how do we recognize that in many cases, when I talk to people in the field, it's smaller models, non-deep learning based approaches, maybe combined with an LLM or two for particular uses that are actually in the fresh air of day doing things that are increasing ROI for businesses, not simply sort of virtuosic chatbots or others. And I will say, Dario mentioned solving cancer. One of the big issues with biotech right now is it's not getting the investment for the long-term risky research that needs to happen if we're actually going to do that. So I have a story, I'm not going to name names, but talking to a friend who's doing incredible research in biotech, right? It is looking to solve cancer, to address cancer, but there's no guarantee that that's going to work. And they can't get a Series B because everyone wants a chatbot, because that's seen as where the money is, right? That's where the state of the art, the benchmarks are being beaten. And I think the VC model, how we're valuing these and what we're actually valuing, needs to change. And again, what I see is a giant opportunity to make markets over here to ask better questions that are more specified to our actual domains, our actual business needs, and to develop evaluations and benchmarks that are measuring these systems in relationship to our needs, not in relationship to sort of sclerotic data sets or sets of tasks that are used to rank these models, but aren't actually reflective of what happens when they hit the fresh air.
So last question for, everyone in this room is asking, what should I do? What is one mistake people in this room will make about AI 10 years from now?
10 years? I mean, 10 seconds.
Right now, 10 years from now. Right now, what's a mistake we're going to make that we're going to realize was a mistake 10 years from now?
I will answer. I see people who are not in tech who would tear the S out of a P&L statement that was flaky or bad, right? They'd be like, why bespoke accounting methods? Like, why is this division doing this and not that, right? Would just right in there with like laser focus, asking no questions about AI. There's almost like a intimidation factor if you're just sort of ceding that ground to sort of promises and claims, using the terms AI as if it were sort of fungible across different systems and different components. Ask the questions, and ask the questions selfishly in relationship to what your business actually needs. What productivity are you going to increase, and how are you measuring that? Like, get down into, does it work with your legacy data? Is your data fungible with that system, or do you have two separate, subsidiaries measuring the same thing very differently, which means you're not going to be able to sort of combine those in any responsible way? Like, these are the detail level questions that need to be asked with the same spirit of confidence that you would sort of, go into a board meeting and talk about the numbers that you're being presented. And, I see a lot of API contracts being signed, and they're not always useful. Right? I see a lot of people wanting an AI strategy, sort of pushing that onto their CTO. The CTO is like, okay, well, we'll sign up for a couple of cloud-based AI systems, but ultimately it becomes a kind of a chatbot you have to mandate your employees to use because no one's finding that much utility out of it. And if you have to mandate that they use it, I think that's a kind of a sign, right? And I think really getting specific as possible. Like, these are not dumb questions. These are fundamental, and you have to be much more selfish about this.